Tonight on Primetime Politics, guilty. A New York jury finds America's 45th president guilty of falsifying business records, making Donald Trump the first U.S. president to be a convicted felon. Coming up, we'll hear from Donald Trump himself, and we'll examine the implications for the Republican Party's presumptive nominee. We'll also look at the implications for Joe Biden's re-election campaign. Plus, lock your doors, avoid face-to-face meetings with constituents. Our political panel will look at the advice given to MPs to ensure their safety and comments from the Sergeant at Arms, who says threats against members has jumped by 700% to 800% in the last 5 years. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. History was made in a New York City courtroom this afternoon. For the first time ever, a former U.S. president has been found guilty in a criminal trial. Donald Trump, now convicted in 34 counts of falsifying business records, all in connection to hush money paid to adult film actress Stormy Daniels. Money to cover up an alleged affair before Americans voted in 2016. The verdict on each of the 34 counts unanimous. Take a listen now to Donald Trump's reaction after the guilty verdict was delivered.
This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end, and we'll win, because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now, from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one, with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
And that was Donald Trump reacting to the verdict earlier today in front of the New York City courtroom. Now, the current U.S. President Joe Biden also reacted to the verdict, the presumptive Democratic nominee, saying this in a statement today, quote, "In New York, we saw that no one is above the law. Donald Trump has always mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain. But today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. There is still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office: at the ballot box. Convicted felon or not," says Joe Biden, "Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. The threat Trump poses to our democracy has never been greater. He is running an increasingly unhinged campaign of revenge and retribution, pledging to be a dictator on day one and calling for our Constitution to be terminated so he can regain and keep power. A second Trump term means chaos, ripping away Americans' freedoms and fomenting political violence, and the American people will reject it this November." Again, that is the statement in full from Joe Biden, the current U.S. president, today. Well, to look at the political implications of today's ruling, we're now joined by Matthew Lebo. He is the chair of the Political Science Department at Western University, specializes in U.S. politics. Matthew, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us so quickly this evening.
Hi.
Listen, going into this trial, Donald Trump enjoyed the support of a majority of Republican voters. Does that change now that he is a convicted felon?
Well, probably not. You know, he has secured a lot of votes in the primaries. He's still getting significant opposition. There's still people going out in Republican primaries and voting for Nikki Haley, even though she dropped out. But that question is really a key, that he has continued to have a majority of Republican voters on his side. There's lots of prominent Republicans, especially today, who would wish that they had an alternative. But for any number of Republicans to try and push him out at this point, they're just risking their own careers. So even with this verdict looming, you saw the other day Nikki Haley endorsed Donald Trump, and now she'll support him. And so this has just been the problem since about 2015, is that Republicans, as Donald Trump gets more and more popular, a Republican can't stick their neck out, say that they would rather have somebody else without really putting their own career in jeopardy. And so, yeah, probably today he still has the Republican majority. He still has a lock on the nomination of the Republican Party. And he looks like, it will go through to the convention and onto the general election.
Okay, so Republicans may not be able to stick their neck out, or at least may be afraid to stick their neck out and criticize Donald Trump even with this conviction. But how bad is it for election hosts? Because at the end of the day, even if he officially becomes the nominee, right now the presumptive nominee, how does this affect a general election for Donald Trump?
Well, everything matters in an election that's going to be so close. So in the 2020 election, Joe Biden got 7 million more votes than Donald Trump, but it was a razor-thin victory in the Electoral College. And we're still looking at 6 key states. The election will be decided in those 6 states. They were all so close last time that moving a few thousand votes, a few 100,000 votes, is just huge. And so there's a huge chunk of Republican voters that will vote for Donald Trump no matter what, that have said that. And then there's some voters that he needs to bring in addition to that, to get over, to get the majority of votes in states like Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania. And today hurts. The Wikipedia page has already been changed to Donald Trump convicted felon. This will be a message that's brought out over and over again. And if it costs him, even 1% of the vote, that can be the election.
So how does that then, okay, it could cost him the vote there. How does that help then Joe Biden? Because, as much as this looks bad on Donald Trump, Joe Biden still has a fair number of critics, in particular people questioning his age and his ability to do the job.
Yeah, so for Joe Biden, this is a much better conversation to be having than his age or his fitness or his stance on Israeli actions in Gaza. So, Joe Biden's hurting in a lot of places. He's hurting with younger voters. He's hurting with people talking a lot about the cost of living. And this is a good thing for him to be talking about, or for the news to be talking about. So one thing that's come out in a lot of polls is when they ask people, about Donald Trump's presidency, it's almost 4 years ago, and the memories aren't so good. People, have better memories of Donald Trump than when he was in office. A lot of people remember, some economic stability, which wasn't really the case, certainly in 2020 and the pandemic. And so this trial and the convictions will remind people of sort of the mayhem of a Trump presidency. And that's, all to the advantage of Biden for people to remember just, all the various aspects of Donald Trump, besides that he's not Joe Biden.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because as you and I are having this conversation, I think it's worthwhile pointing out that even though Donald Trump is convicted now and a convicted felon, this does not actually hinder his ambition for re-election, at least not constitutionally in the United States. Talk to us about that.
Well, definitely nothing hinders his personal ambition, right? He wants to win again. He wants to run again. He's already started with the narrative that the election will be rigged, and whether he wins or loses, he will claim that he won. So, even as a convicted felon, yes, he can run, and he'll certainly use the conviction to try and raise money to talk about how he's the target. And if you turn on, some news channels, they're already talking about this is lawfare, that this is all evidence of Biden's overreaching, that they've gone after him legally. So there's really there's not a legal way to stop him from running for president. What could stop him but won't would be the Republican Party saying enough is enough and doing something to get a new nominee.
Mm-hmm. And we just heard that from Joe Biden's statement, saying that ultimately it will be up to Americans, even with this conviction, to reject Donald Trump come Election Day. Although, is there a question about whether or not Donald Trump can actually vote? Because this is an interesting scenario. He is a convicted felon, but now a resident of Florida because he left New York. So my understanding is in Florida, a convicted felon or a criminal conviction disqualifies someone from voting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. It's possible that he could change his residency, but unlikely. But yeah, convicted felons can't vote in Florida. And that's a really interesting part of Florida politics, right? So Al Gore lost Florida by 527 votes. Had felons been allowed to vote in 2000, he would have been president. So it's kind of interesting to see this now hitting Republicans in a different way. Florida won't be that close. He can win Florida without his own vote. But it's possible that it's just another thing that looks bad, that brings to mind the chaos of another Trump presidency.
Yeah, and as we said right off top, another presidential first here, the first time a U.S. president is a convicted felon. Listen, Matthew Lebo, of course, sentencing, we should tell people at home, will take place July the 11th. We'll be watching that very closely. Until then, thank you, and without a doubt, we'll be speaking again.
Okay, thank you.
Well, time now for a look at what else happened in politics today. The Prime Minister was in Toronto this morning for the opening of a new vaccine manufacturing facility. The largest in Canada, it will create vaccines for whooping cough, diphtheria, and tetanus. The federal government investing $20 million into the $800 million plant built by the French pharmaceutical company Sanofi.
This is the largest biomanufacturing facility in Canadian history, and it will create and maintain hundreds of high-skilled jobs.
Flight attendants landed on Parliament Hill today, calling on the government to end unpaid work in their profession. Joined by the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, union reps say flight attendants work an average of 35 hours a month that go unpaid.
Most Canadians go to their job, whether they're a paramedic or an electrician or a barista. They start getting paid once they put on their uniform, clock in, and start working. But in our industry, as a general rule, airlines do not start compensating us until the plane is in motion, which is usually hours after we've begun our actual work. And when the plane stops, so does our time on the clock.
Those unpaid hours include the time passengers deplane or when flights are held at the gate. The call coming ahead of airline and union negotiations slated for next year. And finally, Oakville, Ontario is being told to repay housing money it received from Ottawa. It comes after its council voted against a motion that would have allowed for more density by permitting fourplexes as of right. The Housing Minister, Sean Fraser, says Oakville's decision breaches their agreement under the Housing Accelerator Fund. And in a statement to CPAC, the Chief of Staff for Oakville's Mayor Rob Burton says the town is already starting the process of returning the money. The Prime Minister was asked about MP safety today, asked to react to the Sergeant-at-Arms who says the harassment of MPs has jumped, up 700 to 800% in the last 5 years. It's why he is recommending MPs to keep their doors locked and to be extra cautious when they meet their constituents. Take a listen now to what Justin Trudeau had to say about the situation.
The current atmosphere of polarization, of toxicity, of misinformation, of disinformation, of anger directed at individuals and institutions is not a healthy trend line for democracy in Canada or everywhere around the world where we are increasingly seeing it. Individual hatreds and acts of violence aimed at people who are serving their communities, who put themselves forward to serve their communities in any order of government, that's unacceptable, and it's something that all Canadians need to be mindful of and aware of as we reflect on what kind of country we are and what kind of country we want to be for the future.
Well, with that, let's bring in our weekly political panel. Carlene Variyan is a former chief of staff to Liberal cabinet ministers, now an associate vice president at Summa Strategies. Mitch Heimpel is a former chief of staff to an Ontario PC minister, and now the director of policy at Enterprise Canada. And here in studio, Anne McGrath, principal secretary to the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh. Hello to the three of you.
Hello, Michael.
Hello.
Hello. Listen, and I'm going to start with you because really in a lot of ways this picks up on the conversation that we were having last week about what MPs are facing when they go out there into the world these days. But you know what really struck me was the number, and to be fair, it's anecdotal because you know the sergeant at arms is saying he believes it's somewhere between 700 to 800% of an increase. But how shocking is that number? Does that surprise you in any way?
Well, I will say that it doesn't surprise me, but it's interesting because last week we were talking about particular instances that had happened, but certainly I've been hearing about it from many of our MPs, but also other MPs from other parties as well. I think that you can't work in politics and not see this all the time, and you know it's maybe a bit innocent or whatever, but one of the things I've always appreciated about Parliament and politics in this country is that you could see a cabinet minister walking down the street by themselves sometimes. You could MPs felt very comfortable going to community events, walking down the street, going to the grocery store, all of those kinds of things. It's not exactly like that anymore. It's not like it's happening every minute of every day, but the evidence is mounting that this is a serious problem. And I think that the recommendations also pose a very serious problem for our democracy and for people's capacity to access their elected representatives. Yeah, and this applies to staff as well, I will say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will pick up on that point. But I'll bring in you, both Carlene and Mitch, on this, beginning with you, Carlene. Does that number surprise you, a huge number?
It doesn't. I think, well, actually, we've been hearing from our security and intelligence officials for years now that radicalization to threats of violence and radicalization all the way to actual acts of violence has been on the rise in this country for quite some time. It's usually grievance fueled. It's usually related to groups of people that feel marginalized or isolated. It's happening to our politicians, but it's also happening in other sectors too. I mean, think of the last few years where we've seen healthcare workers harassed on their way into work at a hospital or a clinic. Think of today where we had for the third time shots fired at a Jewish day school in Montreal. This level of radicalization that is leading to threats and to actual violence to not just our public officials, but other people in our society is really concerning. But I'd have to agree with Anne. I'm unfortunately not surprised to see these numbers related to our members of parliament.
Yeah, Mitch, what do you say to it?
It's also unfortunately not limited to Canada. We've seen examples, I think, two recently from the United Kingdom where members of both the Labour and the Conservative parties have been attacked by constituents or voters in recent years. And that suggests that the trend lines we're seeing in Canada are just an exasperation of things we're seeing internationally. I'm inclined to agree with both of my colleagues that this isn't limited to politics. The example that Carlene just gave about the incidents at Jewish day schools in both Toronto and Montreal in recent days give us significant reason for concern. It is definitely going to be a long-term issue that the parliamentarians better be prepared to deal with in the near future. And I don't know what the necessary immediate tools are going to be at hand for them to do that. But if it involves taking parliamentarians out of the community or making them more hesitant to go to community events, that's a bad thing for democracy.
Yeah, well, let me pick up on that point, though, Mitch, because, part of the recommendation here from the Sergeant at Arms, and this was in that email that went out earlier in the month, where he advised MPs, once again, to keep their doors locked. And this is on the Hill, right, to keep your doors locked and to be very cautious about meeting constituents face to face. You talk about democratic impacts, Anne. What impact are you most worried about here?
Well, I think the impact I'm worried about is that it removes members of parliament from their constituents and from voters, and it reduces the access of voters to their elected representatives. And citizens need to be able to interact with their members of parliament, whether it's on immigration issues, on passport issues, on there's so many things that a member of parliament has to be able to interact with their constituents about. And you can't, we are all, getting better at, electronic things and, not doing things face to face, but there does need to be the capacity to have face to face interaction with your member of parliament. I believe I believe that particular recommendation really gave me a chill.
Yeah, well, to that point, it's always amazing because of the role I get to play. I meet politicians face to face, and the impressions I have is so often different because I am meeting them face to face than people out in the rest of the country. Carlene, I'll get you to add on to that. Talk about the democratic impacts that you're worried about with this situation.
I'm worried about how we are ever going to expect to be able to attract a high caliber of people to put their names on ballots and to want to serve their communities at municipal or provincial or federal levels of government when this is what they can expect. Certainly, as we head into another federal election at some point in the next 12 to 18 months, I know certainly it's the conversation that a lot of Liberals in my corner are having, and that I'm sure to a certain extent people from all political parties are having, is how are we going to persuade people who share our vision of the country to want to put their name forward to run for office when all that we can offer them is possibly, 4 years of a life where you're regularly having to look over your shoulder when you're walking around in your community, or have your office vandalized, or not feel safe, not have your family feel safe. I think that the impacts, the chill on being able to attract people to serve and recruit people to participate in the democratic process is really concerning.
Mitch, what's your take on it?
I think if we view this as just politicians trying to interact through their official capacity, locking the doors in their constituency or on their Hill office, we miss the point of their broader job. We've seen incidents where I believe Melanie Joly was accosted on the street in the city of Montreal. There's obviously the famous incident of the finance minister being accosted in a venue in Edmonton, I believe, a number of years ago. Michelle Rempel-Garner had to file for, I think, a protective order against somebody who had been harassing her. So this gets into an interesting category when you start talking about things like election campaigns, where our members of parliament and candidates have to go door to door. There are a number of scenarios I think we haven't fully considered when we talk about this degree of harassment and violent rhetoric as it pertains to our MPs.
Okay, I'm going to stay with you, Mitch, because you said you weren't entirely certain how it might be addressed, but I will put you on the spot because, when we have this conversation, people do want some type of remedy. People do want to find some type of path out of this, and I appreciate that it's not an easy question to answer, but when you consider that, Mitch, what do you think might be a remedy here?
Wow, you really did put me on the spot there. I
hope you come back.
I think we have options in terms of how we engage with people on social media. That's a big thing. Too often, and we have some members of parliament who do this as a matter of profession, we tone up the rhetoric on social media instead of turning the volume down, and no party's particularly innocent on that score, and that's certainly not helpful. I think we could start there. I think I don't have there is no silver bullet to how we do this. I think it's going to be 10,000 little measures instead of one particular policy fix.
Carlene?
Well, it doesn't help when members of the political class sort of participate in the type of tone and interaction that sets an example that fuels that sort of race to the bottom in terms of the level of discourse and dialogue either. Certainly here in Ottawa, we're into what we call silly season right now, that final stretch of sittings of the House before everybody leaves for summer. And every year it's a bit of a tense time because MPs have had a long year. There's a push to get bunch of legislation through and tensions are high, but I do think that we've all seen that the level of debate in the House has been a bit lower for the last number of weeks as well, and that the tone and approach that some of our politicians are taking, and it applies to all parties, is maybe not where it should be either. So I think the tone does need to start at the top, and Mitch sort of alluded to that. But again, to just take a bit of a broader view here of the type of causes of that radicalization that leads people to make threats or to attack a public official in public, or to actually move to violence. There's a ton of research that's done in the academic world and has been done for a long time about things that can prevent that. And so far, nobody's figured out what the magic bullet is, part of the expression, that can help it. What a lot of the conclusions are is that isolation of communities certainly doesn't help, that trying to bring a broader diversity of perspectives into any issue, whatever the form, and that would certainly include politics, can help to ensure that people who feel more distant from centers of decision-making, like Parliament Hill in Ottawa, are more included. Those types of things can help, but I'm talking about very pie in the sky ideas right now in terms of, what could we do in the next month, in the next year? It's, I think, as Mitch said, going to be a lot of little things, and I do think the tone has to start at the top.
Anne?
Yeah, I'd agree that there's no magic solution to this, but I think there are some policy things that could address some of it, and we talked a little bit about some of these last week, but I'm a big believer in some form of electoral reform to introduce some level of proportionality into our electoral system, and also public financing of political parties, because I do believe that the imperative for political parties to fundraise primarily through social media these days and through digital, it creates the desire to whip up people's emotions, and I think that that's very, very damaging, I think, to our political discourse. So I think public financing of political parties would go a long way.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, that is as much time as we have for today, but really appreciate the conversation. Obviously, an important one given the type of figures that were shared here by the Sergeant at Arms. So Anne, Carlene, Mitch, thank you for the time this evening.
Thank you.
And that is our program for this Thursday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.